It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Douglas Blackman. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to the Miller Center's American Forum. I'm Doug Blackman. In this era of bitter division between political parties and paralyzed government in Washington, D.C., Americans often despair that our politics must be more toxic than at any previous time, and that there seems to be no solution for a gridlocked Congress and stubbornly uncooperative national leaders. Our guest today says in a new book that both of those assumptions are untrue, that America was stuck in a remarkably similar way a century ago, and how that enormous political logjam was ultimately broken by President Theodore Roosevelt and others may be a prescription for healing our corrosive political process today. Michael Wohlreich is the author of Unreasonable Men, Theodore Roosevelt and the Republican Rebels Who Created Progressive Politics. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. We all know the basic story of Teddy Roosevelt, and some of us know it really well. We know the Rough Rider. We know that guy, this funny guy, full of bravado, but I don't think we really understand him politically very well. And I think the fact that he was a Republican is actually confusing to us because he's associated with a kind of politics that we don't really associate with the GOP today. Though I confess, I'm not even sure I could sort out all of that. And so, so as he's an emerging politician, political figure in New York City first and then later for the whole state.
He was a Republican, staunch Republican through and through. In fact, furious with his cousin Franklin, who when he joined the Democrats. As a wealthy New Yorker, so there was no real question. The Republican Party was really the way was bound to be Roosevelt's party. And particularly given the corruption of the Democratic machine in New York, for him to be a reformer cleaning up state politics, it made a lot of sense for him to be a Republican. It also didn't, the Republicans didn't have quite didn't have the reputation of conservatives that they do today. There were, as I mentioned, there were conservatives in both parties, and so there were a few other reformers in both parties, and Roosevelt saw himself as the man to reform the Republican Party, and then take those reforms and bring them first to New York City as well, and then national.
These days, the word progressive has been revived and is used by a lot of people again in American discussions as a replacement for the word liberal, which came to be reviled by a lot of people. And a lot of liberals became kind of embarrassed about that word. Now people love to use the word progressive, and so a subtitle, like the one in your book, is confusing. The idea that it was a Republican and a Republican president and some other rebel Republicans who created progressive politics. How can that be?
Well, many people don't realize that the ideological divisions that we have today were not along party lines. It was not always that way. And in fact, at the turn of the 20th century, it looked as if it could go either way. Both parties, Democrats and Republicans, were divided between what we now call conservatives and reformers that we now call progressives. And there was a very strong insurgency in the Republican Party and a very strong push to make the Republican Party the progressive party. Now, ultimately, it didn't go that way.
What did progressive mean in that period of time, and what was the division of the parties, and what did they stand for immediately before what we call the rise of the progressives?
The term progressive was not really used, at least in America, in a political context, at least not in any ideological sense. There were reformers. They were sometimes referred to as half-breeds, as in half Republican, but there was no clear ideological concept or label at that time. The parties were divided more by region than by ideology. They had the Democrats were strong in the South and in the big cities like New York, Milwaukee, Chicago. And the Republicans dominated pretty much everywhere else. And in fact, Republicans had dominated American politics pretty much through the Civil War, since the Civil War, with a few exceptions.
And Republicans also were the political home of essentially all African Americans, wherever they were, even though there were increasing difficulties for African Americans to actually vote in the South. But wherever black people were, they tended to be Republicans.
Absolutely. The Democrats were the party of the white South, first and foremost. So this is the height of America's Industrial Revolution, and we have big tycoons becoming richer and richer, more powerful. There's a lot of consolidation among corporations. The small companies that people were used to were growing very large, and there were fewer and fewer of them every year, much to the alarm of many of the citizens of the country. The income and wealth inequality was soaring to levels never before seen in the United States. There was economic instability. Every 10 years there would be a tremendous panic. They called it then, what we now call a recession, or a financial crisis that leads to a recession or even a depression. The environment was deteriorating. The industries were exploiting all of the country's natural resources and polluting a lot of the waterways. So there were a lot of interesting parallels between now, where we again have income inequality and again have environmental challenges. There was also a lot of corporate influence in government that people were not used to. These tycoons, these trusts, used their financial clout to influence government. The local parties in each state were run by political machines. There would be a boss, and the boss would hand out jobs to his supporters in return for them drumming up votes. It was called the patronage system. But he needed money to run his operation, and that came from business.
I mean, they would make big campaign contributions, or did they buy politicians off? Or I mean, how did it work?
That could be bribery. There were plenty of delegates bribed or votes bought, but a lot of it was a form that we're familiar with today. A lot of it was just campaign contributions, and that certainly happened at the federal level. Theodore Roosevelt, who, despite coming out very strongly against the trusts, his campaign raised a lot of money from the large tycoons, J.D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan. A lot of the railroad tycoons, et cetera.
And so Teddy Roosevelt is a rich guy from Oyster Bay, New York. What role is he playing in all of this in the decade before he emerges as a national figure?
Roosevelt, as everyone knows, was somebody different. He was idiosyncratic. He was his own man, and he cut a very different course through politics than people were used to. He was always a reformer. Even early on as a legislature in the state government of New York, he pushed for reforms. He was anti-corruption. He was trying to change the patronage system to switch to a more meritocratic way of recognizing and elevating public servants. But he was not necessarily. He was not the crusader that he is often remembered as, and in the Ken Burn had a Roosevelt special which presented him as this fighter, this man who wouldn't take no and wouldn't compromise with his enemies, and that was actually not Theodore Roosevelt. He was very cautious about it. He wanted to change the country incrementally, one step at a time. This was partly because, as you said, he came from old money, and he was concerned about the populist agitation that was happening, particularly out west, what we now call the Midwest. But he was concerned that it was too drastic, too violent, too dangerous. But the other thing is he was a very practical man, and he knew that if he pushed for aggressive measures to change the country, that the conservative powers in government would shut them down. This happened in New York State and happened also once he became president. So he would work with his opponents and compromise with them to get as much change as he felt he could accomplish.
And Roosevelt emerges as a widely recognized figure, first as the police commissioner for New York City, right? And then later becomes governor. But by the time he's governor of New York, he's not at all popular with other Republicans.
Well, he had a lot of conflicts with the Republican establishment because the Republican establishment and the Democratic establishment were both conservative. And so here was this young gun, because he was a young guy, and he was from this patrician class that didn't usually go into politics. And all of a sudden he's jumping in there and saying, we got to go after these corrupt judges, and we got to stop the influence of the corporations, and we got to do regulation, which nobody was thinking about at that time. And the establishment pushed back, and so he frequently found himself at odds with them. And in fact, one of the greatest stories about the rise of Theodore Roosevelt is the reason he ended up vice president was the Republican establishment in New York was trying to sideline him. They wanted him out of New York because he was governor there, and they felt mucking up the state. The vice presidency at that time was a dead-end job that no one wanted, and they thought, well, they could maneuver Roosevelt to get in there, then he'll be out of our hair, and we won't have to think about him again. And there was one of the big Republican leaders from Ohio, who was national leader, warned them at the time, like he said to these guys from New York, don't you realize that he'll be just one life away from the presidency?
9 months later, the assassination.
And Theodore Roosevelt became president.
Yeah, so it's one of the most delicious ironies in American political history, really, that the Republicans of New York really thought they were done with Teddy Roosevelt when they had installed him as vice president, and look what happened. When was it and how was it that then this political situation that reminds us of the present begins to emerge in that period of time, and who were the other key characters?
So there were the Republican Party at that time was dominated really by two figures. There was one was the Speaker of the House. He became Speaker of the House a couple years into Roosevelt's presidency, but he was up and coming for a while, and he was very powerful. His name was Joseph Gurney. Joseph Gurney Cannon, but everyone called him Uncle Joe. He was this irascible old-time old-time politician, raised in a log cabin, spoke with the drawl, he loved to smoke cigars all the time, was always chewing a cigar, swigging whiskey, cursing, telling little Bible tales. Everyone loved this guy. He was incredibly charming, and he worked his way up through the party, but also very conservative. He believed that the government should be as small as possible and stay out of everyone's lives as much as possible. And he used his power as Speaker of the House to essentially shut down any reform. And he was immensely powerful, probably the most powerful Speaker of the House we've had in American history. At that time, congressmen could not speak on the floor without the Speaker's permission. They could not motion a bill. No bills could leave committee without his approval. And he used that power to exact incredible loyalty from the Republican Party, even from Democrats, because if you bucked Uncle Joe, then that was you didn't get to none of your pet projects that you wanted to bring back to your home state, they would never get voted in. So everyone did what Uncle Joe said. There was a similar leader in the Senate, another Republican, but very different from Uncle Joe. His name was Nelson Aldrich. He's actually the grandfather of Nelson Rockefeller, who was governor of New York. Nelson Aldrich was from Rhode Island, and he was much more of an East Coast guy. He was chums with J.P. Morgan and a lot of the big trust leaders at the time. He didn't, in those days, senators wore these long frock coats they were called Prince Albert frock coats because Prince Albert had popularized them. And they would, they'd stand up and they'd, do their speeches with their hands tucked into their lapels. Nelson Aldrich was, he dressed like a businessman. He dressed in a more conventional suit. He spoke quietly, didn't like to talk on the Senate floor. He worked behind the scenes. And he had 3 allies, of which he was pretty much the leader. They were called the Big Four, and they ruled the Senate. They had the power over the committees, and they used their power to pass whatever legislation that essentially they wanted, or shut down the legislation that they didn't want. So you had a very similar law code by conservatives on the Senate and in Congress. And Roosevelt, having been elevated to president now, all of a sudden had to deal with these 2 guys who regarded him with great skepticism, and he dealt with it by working with them. Particularly in his first term, he didn't challenge them. He let them deal with domestic policy. He focused on international policy, which he was much more interested in. They were much more willing to give him a free hand on.
No, Roosevelt was, if I recall correctly, was actually very concerned about whether he would be nominated for the presidency in 1904. That was part of his passiveness, I guess, in that period, is that he's not at all sure that, even though he's ended up in the White House, that the Republicans will want to keep him there in 1904. I mean, is that part of what's going on, that he's trying to not rock the boat too much?
Absolutely. I mean, he was a political animal. He felt insecure about the way he had become president. He hadn't been elected in his own right. He was concerned about opposition in the Republican Party, with good reason, because if he had pushed too hard, they might have, and there was even talk of running someone against him for the nomination in 1904. So that was part of it. He also felt just that he didn't have a mandate. He had
somebody else's
come into
chair.
office
Right.
by accident, exactly. So he was hesitant for that reason.
What is it about the conflict between these 3 figures and him and the Republican Party, and then the person you talk about a great deal in the book, Robert La Follette? Where does he come into this, and how do the politics begin to unfold?
So Bob La Follette was first a congressman, then a governor, then a senator from Wisconsin, and he was a really crucial figure and a really fascinating figure in this era. And while the title of my book includes Theodore Roosevelt and doesn't, adding La Follette would have been too long. It's really about both these men. La Follette is not nearly as well remembered as Roosevelt, with in large part for good reason. But I do think that not enough attention has been paid to him recently, particularly as we get back to some of the progressive politics and some of the populism that La Follette championed 100 years ago. I mean, Bob La Follette would have been at the head of Occupy Wall Street if he were around today. He was a reformer like Roosevelt, but he had much more aggressive about it, much less willing to compromise. La Follette set his sights on the conservative Republican establishment in Wisconsin and essentially took down the machine. He fought for 8 years through 3 governor's elections before he was elected governor of Wisconsin, and then set about radically changing the system. He wanted to regulate the railroad industry and the lumber industry, which hadn't been done, certainly not in Wisconsin. He wanted to bypass eliminate the caucuses, because the caucuses were very corrupt. Many of the delegates were bribed, and they used this to hold power in Wisconsin. La Follette despised this. He wanted voters to elect their party nominees directly, and pioneered this direct primary, which is now the standard in almost all states, with a few exceptions.
And La Follette then so he's a Republican who's outraged by the way the Republican Party works, and also outraged by the Democratic Party. And so he's this insurgent leading a larger group of populist insurgents against both parties, in a sense. So he's our Tea Party leader, if we try to make a historical parallel.
I often compare him to Ted Cruz from Texas. He is, I would say, Cruz's mirror image, or Cruz is his mirror image. where they used many of the same tactics that La Follette used. These very sensational tactics. He liked to filibuster. He would refuse to compromise. He pushed for bills that had absolutely no chance of passing, knowing that they would go down in flames. But he did it to draw attention and converts to his cause. He'd push these bills, and then when they failed, as he knew they would, in the next election, he would go around, first Wisconsin, later around the whole United States, and he would talk to people about his bills, and then he would read out the roll call of who voted for these bills. And many people didn't realize that their leaders, that their representatives were voting against these bills that they appreciated. So La Follette used these to primary conservatives in the Republican Party, much the way the Tea Party does today. So he was the first Republican insurgent. He was just a progressive insurgent.
And we can overdraw these historical parallels and go too far with them. Nonetheless, it's interesting, I think, to try to find these comparisons, because in the current political dynamic, most sort of conventional political activists, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, look somewhat disdainfully at the Tea Party. There's a lot of discussion in America about that the Tea Party is an obstructionist element, that that the refusal of its supporters to compromise is a real problem and is obstructing what's happening in American life. So there's a lot of criticism of this vigilance around, no, we want it all. We're going to vote over and over again to repeal the Affordable Care Act because we think it ought to be repealed. And we don't care that it's not going to go anywhere. It's a symbolic gesture. And that seems very parallel to what you're talking about, what is viewed as one of the most important changes in American political evolution.
It was absolutely parallel. La Follette was despised certainly by the conservative establishment in the Republican Party, but even by more moderates. Theodore Roosevelt never liked La Follette. He felt that La Follette was getting in the way of the incremental change that he was trying to do, because he'd be working with the conservatives to pass these bills, and La Follette would be out there pushing these much more radical bills that could never be passed. And Roosevelt, he was so practical, he didn't even get it. He sort of looked at La Follette and would be like, what is he thinking? He can't pass these bills. He knows he can't pass these bills. He must be doing it just to basically raise his own profile, and because he wants to run for president. In the same way that accusations that people make against Ted Cruz today.
And which also sounds a lot like Barack Obama, the way you've just described Teddy Roosevelt, as this president who doesn't have the political power to push his own agenda through Congress as freely as he would like, or really at all at this point, but is baffled by these symbolic actions by this insurgent group over here, and who is widely criticized for not being able to somehow negotiate this, but also I think maybe just doesn't get the idealism of the Tea Party.
That's very fair and very astute. And writing this book, the book is all history. Outside the preface, I don't talk about today, but there's so many parallels that I think come through from this era. And I think one of them is the approaches of Obama and Theodore Roosevelt. They were very different characters, but their strategy, their governing strategy, was legislative strategy was very similar. They sized up the opposition. They said, well, I don't think I can pass this bill that I'd like to pass, so I'm going to figure out, I'm going to scale it back and push the bill that I think can pass, and they'd negotiate for a bit and try to push something, and then take the best bill they could get.
Which also sounds very Clintonian. I mean, in terms of a successful Democratic president at that, but that Clinton pulled off very well, but that in the end, Obama, beyond his early years, has actually not been able to get much at all. Hasn't even been able to make that work as a legislative strategy.
What we saw in this era 100 years ago, so much like today, was that when you're dealing with an opposition that is absolutely not interested in compromise and is essentially trying to shut down any kind of movement whatsoever, compromise doesn't work. You get what La Follette called half-a-loaf measures that look good and seem like you're getting something done, but really just sates people's appetites without really changing the status quo. And so La Follette would argue it's better that sometimes half a loaf is actually worse than no loaf at all. Better to push for the big bill that what he felt was the right bill, and lose, and then use that loss to hammer your opponents in the next election, rather than to get some compromise watered down bill that won't really change things.
Yeah, very much like the elections of 2014. But I guess if we extend the historical comparison all the way out, what this tells us is that in another few years, Barack Obama will join up with the Tea Party and become leader of that faction. Maybe that's going too far.
It can't be the bull moose. That's been done. He's got to have another party name.
Exactly. While these changes are happening and government is extending out into places it's never been before, and there's a democratization of democracy happening unlike anything seen before, what is happening to African Americans?
Not much, unfortunately, at this time. There was Theodore Roosevelt had some, he was like many people in the era. He had racist ideas. First of all, he was more, much more willing to meet with black leaders. With certain, he kind of divide up between, the African Americans that he felt were trustworthy and reasonable versus the hoi polloi that he was very skeptical of. So he did make some inroads, but he also had some failures in that score.
There's an incident in Brownsville, Texas that becomes a sort of seminal event in terms of race for Roosevelt. What was it that happened with those soldiers?
So there were reports of a rampage by black soldiers in the town of Brownsville, Texas. And these reports, there's much debate about what really happened, but the reports were not very credible. It certainly seemed to be exaggerated. But these were white people saying that black people had come and killed someone and menaced our town, and something has to be done about these black troops. And Roosevelt demanded an investigation, and the investigators went in and talked to the soldiers, and nobody admitted anything. And so Roosevelt was like, well, that's typical of these African Americans. Of course, he referred to as Negro soldiers, that they cover things up and they're dishonest and shifty, and I'm just going to dishonorably discharge all of them, even though certainly all of them, if any of them, actually conducted this rampage. And he was attacked by, to their credit, some of the conservative Republicans were what we would now call liberal on race issues. And some of these conservative Republicans criticized Roosevelt for doing this, and it did create a split within his party over this. But for the most part, not much was, Taft was trying to conciliate the South. Wilson, of course, was a Democrat and was famously racist. So there was talk about concern about lynching, and there was reporting about lynching and some of the what we now call Jim Crow laws from that era, but there was not a lot being accomplished on behalf of America's African Americans.
Yeah, I think it's one of the other really remarkable junctures in our history, in our more recent history, of that this is this moment when, really for the first time, government at various levels begins to be employed on a significant scale to deal with poverty and working conditions and income inequality. And if one thinks those are good things, doesn't matter, but this gigantic event that changes the lives of millions and millions of people and generations of people in very dramatic ways, and then sets the stage for what comes in the New Deal legislation in the 1930s. And meanwhile, you have, though, in the same way that Roosevelt represented an openness to some of this, but a timidity about some of it as well, he's the same way on race. He comes in a sort of nominal racist of the time, an average racist, but probably not a venal racist, believes that he's affectionate toward African Americans, though he clearly views them as in a lesser status. Does one radical thing, I don't think you discuss this in the book, but when he invites Booker T. Washington to the White House to dinner, and Booker T. Washington sits there with his daughter, and much of the country goes into apoplexy over the scene of this. There was an editorial in a newspaper in Mississippi that said, "We shall have to kill 1,000 of them to send the lesson that this abomination, this kind of abomination, couldn't occur. And so it's remarkable that he starts there, but then by the end of his presidency, he has essentially abandoned all interest in African Americans in this picture. And then we end up with Woodrow Wilson, who's not just a famous racist, but an inveterate white supremacist.
I think Roosevelt was very chastened by the response to his meeting with Booker T. Washington, and that's part of the reason he said, well, this is not the fight that we're going to have right now. To the point about the equality, Democrats in their party platform would talk about they're the party of equality. But by equality, they meant equality between rich and poor. They didn't mean equality between blacks and whites.
It's also fascinating, I think, to remember in a conversation like this what things were like in America then, what the reality on the ground was for the American people, because we lose track of that. It is a world in which there's no Social Security. Almost no one has any kind of retirement benefits, no normal people, regular people, or any sort of security in their old age. Most people in rural parts of the country, certainly in the rural South, are living in third world conditions. There's no running water anywhere. Obviously, there's not electricity yet. There are hardly any paved roads anywhere in the Deep South and in much of the West. Local governments are extremely small and controlled by the parties. There's almost no local taxation. The federal government lives primarily off the tariff. There's no income tax. And so we really have a world in which both government on the local and the state level and the federal level is starved of resources across the board, and in fact doesn't do a great deal beyond these sort of international matters and defense. And so a lot of what this struggle is about is not just sort of high-minded idealism versus reactionary conservatism. It's really about whether the country is going to remain like that, part third world, or if it's going to become something else in the 20th century.
Yeah, I would put it a little differently. I mean, people certainly weren't clamoring for Social Security or health care and the sort of things that we're looking for today, but they felt, I think one of the strongest ideas and concerns and passions sort of running through the electorate was that people felt very much vulnerable. They felt there were a lot of changes going on through industry, and they felt the country was spinning, it was out of their control, and it was being, they pointed fingers at the people who they thought were controlling it, which was the rich bankers and industrialists out east. So, and it was that vulnerability, that the sense that sort of the world was unpredictable with these financial crises and inflation was a big concern. They didn't call it that, but they were concerned about the cost of living very much. And they saw, these growing class divisions between the very rich and the very poor. And these are more universal concerns and ideas than simply simply retirement, say, or healthcare and that sort of thing. But it's I think ideas that still resonate today.
Yeah, not unlike how after the economic collapse of 2008, that it was not a very ideological thing for people to have the sense that these distant bankers in New York City who had gotten all these benefits from the government in the wake of the collapse, that somehow they were responsible for the difficulties of everybody else, whether middle class or poor, and a sense of frustration and outrage toward that, whether it's true or not, but a very similar kind of public reaction.
Certainly, and that's on the left and the right, as you say. I mean, there's a strong sort of anti-Wall Street thread that runs through the Tea Party, and we see it as we saw it in Virginia when Eric Cantor lost his seat to somebody who was concerned about cronyism and corporate influence. So that's still with us across the political spectrum, and I think is having an increasing impact and effect on American politics, much as it was a century ago.
It's not so much that the parallels predict the future for us, but they help us to reset our frame and maybe blank out some of our misperceptions and conceptions of the present, such as that it's just interesting that La Follette and his followers, who end up being historical in the sense of the big changes that occur to America, which are generally regarded as positive changes, nonetheless were viewed by people like Teddy Roosevelt as problematic people, shrill and extreme and inflexible. in the same way that there's a real tendency among moderates and others to view the Tea Party today and to be dismissive of them, and in particular to dismiss their idealism, which, if regardless of what one thinks about their politics, actually I think the idealism of the Tea Party is pretty legitimate.
I absolutely agree. And it's not just the Tea Party, it's also on the left. I mean, you're starting to see resurgence of Democratic left. The most prominent figure is Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, of course. But there are a number of others who are in office or running for office who are embracing these sort of old-time populist, progressive, anti-corporate ideas and rhetoric, and they're, the Democratic establishment is sort of looking a bit askance at them. They want to harness the passion, but they're concerned about getting unelectable people running for office. And I think as we move towards 2016 and elections after that, we're going to start to see a stronger and stronger Democrat insurgency as well.
You say in the introduction of the book something very grand and sweeping that if you had written it in a history PhD dissertation would have been you'd have been slapped down by your major professor. But you say history offers a solution to our modern political dysfunction. What is that solution?
The intuitive idea that you need to approach politics practically in the short term and work for changes piecemeal, one at a time, because that's the best that you can get in the current context, is often the wrong way of looking at things. That it can very much help you get elected, and it can very much help you pass some legislation, but it's not a long-term view of politics. This is where Roosevelt and the Follett differed very much, because Roosevelt was, up until after his presidency, when he became more of a crusader, he was very much looking at the next election and looking at, well, what is my, what can I get done during this term? Whereas La Follette was taking a longer view of of politics and saying, look, it's not enough to pass this bill or win this election. You need to change the way people understand politics. You need to change the power structure that it has been that is ruling the country right now, and that's going to mean some short-term losses. If we push these ideas and these candidates that can't win, but in the long run, we can persuade people that what we're doing is right. And I think it was a very astute way of looking at politics. I think it's something that the Tea Party has been doing very much and very effectively. And in fact, I think it was even before, I tracked the conservative insurgency to go back at least until the 1970s, if not before that, back even to Goldwater. But there's been this trend of a long-term view of how are we going to change the Republican Party and make it more conservative and more consistent with our ideas, and they've been very effective at doing that. The Democrats, I think, have been taking a much more pragmatic view of politics, and particularly initiated by President Clinton with his triangulation of keeping ourselves in power. And I think Democrats have gained in the short term by this, but at the expense of the long term. So it's important not to lose sight of the long term, and it's important to be willing to lose in order to win the hearts and minds of the country, which is really what drives politics, and more particularly what drives political change, which is the goal here.
I guess you would look at New York City and the election of Mayor de Blasio as an example of this insurgency on the left, of a redefining of what democratic politics mean and moving significantly to the left in New York City. That's a version of these events on the left, and then on the right is the Tea Party, as we understand a little more clearly, I think. And then you've got Barack Obama, who, yes, has played this mediator in chief who really never was able to mediate very much, but who did force through his one great legislative achievement in terms of the Affordable Care Act, whether you like it or don't, but it's a consequential legislative achievement, did it in a completely uncompromising way with no Republicans involved, is battered all the time for that. But by your argument, you would say that actually, I think, that's the one part of the Obama era which will stand up as having been a principled achievement, even though it may well have led to really serious injury to the ability of the Democratic Party to remain in power.
The Obama administration started out very much trying to compromise with the Republican parties, and only very belatedly adopted the strategy of going on their own. And I think, in fact, if they had started with that strategy earlier, they might have gotten a healthcare plan more like what many of the Democrats actually wanted, something that was a little bit more ambitious than what they got.
So the solution that history gives us is more polarization.
Unfortunately, I think yes. I think many of the greatest periods of political change in America have come about, have emerged from periods of great polarization. The elimination of slavery in the Civil War, for example, or the FDR's New Deal. Like, these were very polarized times, and there was a knockdown, drawn-out fight for two very different ideologies, and one side won, and were able to enact the changes that they wanted to accomplish. Now, it's much more difficult in the United States than it is in other countries with a parliamentary system, because we've got all the checks and balances. So you really have to win big in order to accomplish these. But I think in the current context, where nothing's really happening anyway, I don't see in the foreseeable future the two parties coming together and saying, oh, well, here's all these great things that we can agree on, and we can get some important change through. I don't see it happening. I think we have to have this fight, and there's got to be a winner, essentially.
And it looked like that winner was clear. Even in 2012, it looked like that even though the Democrats and President Obama had lots of problems and popularity difficulties, it looked like then 2012 settled that, in fact, this was the predominant political movement in America, and there was a lot of talk about the Republican Party reforming itself in various ways, becoming more open to other kinds of people other than elderly white men. But there's also been a real retrenchment around, and there's a version of that from this historical story as well, isn't there?
Well, I mean, that's the nature of politics, right? You'll have a big leap, and then the party in power will lose popularity eventually, which happened by the end of Wilson's second term. And then there'll be a retrenchment, and it'll be another couple decades before you have another big leap. I don't think that Democrats made a big leap when they returned to power in the Congress in 2006, and then with the presidency in 2008. I think they were. It was not a very ideological party at that point. It was a very practical party, and they were. They became the big tent party that the Republicans used to be back before the Tea Parties, and as a result, made it difficult for them to accomplish a lot of change, because they were relying on conservative Democrats who weren't on board for serious changes.
So how is it and why is it that there is this transformation of Teddy Roosevelt that becomes the thing we remember him most for?
In Roosevelt's second term, he was more aggressive, and he still picked his fights carefully, but he did pick some fights, and he did fight harder against Uncle Joe and Nelson Aldrich than he had in his first term, particularly over railroad regulation. But there was still very much the same Roosevelt. He would fight and fight, and then he didn't see his way to passing the bill, and then he'd go behind the scenes and compromise. And many of the reformers were furious at him for what they felt were his compromises, even in his second term. But he drives straight through, finishes up his term, says that he's not going to serve a third term, and handpicks William Taft to succeed him. When Taft came to power, Roosevelt went off to Africa and Europe to give for a year and a half to give Taft some space, and Taft did what Roosevelt did. He worked with the conservatives who were in power. He worked with Nelson Aldrich and Uncle Joe. He'd take rides with them in his white steam-driven car that I'm not sure it was white, but a steam-driven car. They'd talk policy, and they'd talk about, well, what are we going to do about La Follette and these insurgents? How are we going to keep these things going? Meanwhile, LaFollette's progressive insurgency was gaining steam. When he came to the Senate, he was just a lone figure. People ridiculed him, thought he's going nowhere. But these tactics, these aggressive tactics worked. They drew people to his cause. His allies won primary elections, and this progressive insurgency it was actually LaFollette who popularized the term progressive because there was no label before then. It started to gain force. So now Roosevelt comes back from Europe and Africa, and he sees this polarization that's taken place, that Taft has not successfully held to the middle as he had during his presidency. And in fact, it was probably impossible at that time. It worked early on before all this polarization, but at that time you couldn't be in the middle. You had to choose a side. And he saw that Taft had chosen the conservative side. And he saw this as a betrayal. He also changed himself. Whatever the country felt was kind of the way he felt. So Bob LaFollette would be out in front, kind of trying to pull people this way, and the conservatives would be out back, trying to hold the country back, and Roosevelt would be right there on the crest of the wave. And so he actually, when he returned, was more progressive than when he'd been president. And he sort of embraced this ethos. And he too chose a side, but he now chose the progressive side, then ultimately ran for president against Taft as the progressive leader, much to LaFollette's dismay, because LaFollette was trying to run for president as a progressive leader. So the two of them, these two progressive leaders, now were now running against each other for first the Republican nomination, and then when Roosevelt didn't get the nomination and felt in fact that he'd been cheated out of the nomination because he felt that the political machines had used tricks to take the Republican nomination away from him, then decided to do what he had always accused LaFollette of doing, and that's bolting the Republican Party. And in fact, he bolted. LaFollette stayed Republican. Theodore Roosevelt, as everyone knows, started we call it the Bull Moose Party, but the official name was the Progressive Party of the United States.
And we end up with this very famous three-way election in 1912 that then produces Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, and who we then associate many of these specific progressive reforms as much with him as with anyone else. And he embraced. After he wins, he comes out and says it's time for all progressive, whatever political affiliation you have, to come together and forge a new era.
Well, exactly. Wilson was also influenced by these changes at the time, and he was more cerebral about it than Theodore Roosevelt. But he had been conservative, before he became governor of New Jersey. In fact, it was the conservative political bosses in New Jersey picked him and put him, chose him for their nominee because they felt that he would represent the conservative interests and the political machine interests. It was at that time in 1910 that Wilson started to belatedly embrace the progressive ideas that LaFollette and some other Democrats like William Jennings Bryan were supporting. And so he becomes a progressive leader, but he didn't start out that way. And then, I think another important point that people don't remember is that once he became president and once he was pushing for these tremendous changes through Congress, from the income taxes to labor laws, to antitrust laws, and ultimately women's suffrage. These were not pushed through by the Democrats over the heads of the Republicans. There were a lot of progressive Republicans, mainly from LaFollette's faction, who were working with progressive Democrats, and they were opposed by conservative Democrats and conservative Republicans at that time. So it was this bipartisan progressive alliance that really pushed through the famous changes that we associate with Woodrow Wilson's administration.
Yeah, and so much of what's happening at that time, again, it's sort of hard for us to remember the significance of some of this because some of it is obscure, like the introduction of the income tax, we get that, but also the introduction of directly elected senators. That's actually much more significant than just how senators are elected. It begins to establish the notion of one man, one vote in a much more tangible way. Does lead to women's suffrage in many other respects. All of the discussion around child labor laws that hadn't existed. On this whole, all these different fronts, and not just the reforms themselves, but also just the idea that it's the role of government to intervene into these private matters of citizens, of who gets to vote and under what circumstances and what your work life should be. And so even though the policies themselves may seem a little arcane or obscure, they actually represent a fairly revolutionary change in the nature of government itself.
Absolutely, and I think even tariff reform, it seems arcane, but the fundamental issue of tariff reform was that the tariffs were driven by corporations. Essentially, they would go in there into Nelson Aldrich's committee, and they would write the legislation that gave their industry favored tariffs, and they would work it out in minute detail with the sugar tariff, for example, like how many, what percentage of refinement would result, would get what kind of tariff, and they would do that to basically crush their smaller competitors and take advantage over international competitors and consolidate their influence. So the tariff, what the tariffs were about, what the fight was about, it was about corporate influence in government, and that's something. Even though the tariff doesn't play the same role there, we have it today. We have it a lot of times. We have it, for example, with corporate subsidies, which are it's really the same thing. It's really the same fight that we were fighting back then.
Which is a little bit like, again, the broader discussion that we're having in America right now, that is still about size of government, big government versus small government, role of government. Also, I think very interesting, again, not to overdraw the historical parallels, but we now do go into this period of wondering what happens with this incredibly historic, whether we like him or not, but this incredibly historic president of Barack Obama as a young, very young person, still in the prime of his life, who will end up as an ex-president, but with an enormous following in America, in some respects, somewhat like Teddy Roosevelt. What role is he going to play over the next 30 years, probably, that he will remain an important figure in American life? So just as the question existed for Roosevelt.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. I think we're going to start seeing a lot of changes, actually. Even though now it seems the world seems dark, and it seems like, well, Congress just can't do anything and nothing's going to happen in the foreseeable future. That was how people felt back in 1906 and 1908. There was the same sense that Congress is never going to change. And then 4 years later, it was changes that seemed unimaginable 4 years earlier. And I think, I don't know if it'll take 4 years or 8 years or 12 years, but I think the times call, and I think the country will ultimately rise to the call, and we'll see the kind of dramatic changes that we need to deal with the crises of today.
The question is just which way.
That's a good point.
Before we finish, you're not a trained classic historian. You're not a longtime journalist. You've written more software than literature. You had an earlier book about politics, but this book, which is splendidly done, just have to say, just splendidly done, with a kind of granular research and wonderful writing, and it just sort of sprung out of the ether. How did that happen?
Thank you, first of all. I assure you that it did not spring out of the ether. I wish it had sprung out of the ether, but there were a lot of grueling hours went into that ether before this thing came out. I was a blogger starting actually with the election of 2008, and achieved some attention and some success as a blogger first, and then went from there to my previous book that you mentioned, which was it was called Blowing Smoke. And I was talking about this and figuring out why, when it seems like everyone should go, why when it seems like the Republicans should moderate to be more successful, they would go to the right, and they would still be more successful. Like the Republican, you didn't just start with the Tea Party, the Republican Revolution of 1994. And so I was trying to figure out how this was happening and how they'd been so successful and how a lot of the ideas were working so well. And so in many ways, that was really a book about insurgent politics and how they work and how they can be effective. But I think a lot of the thought the thought behind it, and a lot of the history work that I did for that first book, ended up kind of taking that and blowing that out and writing more of a full-blown history book for this one. So I don't think they were entirely isolated.
And when the Washington Post reviewed your book not all that long ago, it was written, Unreasonable Men invites comparison with another book on the same era, Doris Kearns Goodwin's The Bully Pulpit, and then it goes on to say from the reviewer, if I had to choose between them, I would go with Unreasonable Men. That's pretty heady stuff.
It was a great honor. Now I should add that the reason they went with mine was by virtue of brevity and price. He basically said these are two great books, and you buy this one to save money. But
I don't think it was quite as simple as that.
but even being compared to her and to her book, which particularly I felt I didn't know she was writing this book, and I found out right as I was sending in the final draft of mine, her book was launched, and I was like, oh my goodness, like how can I, writing about very different books, but about many of the same people, about the same era, and I felt like, how can I compete with her? And I can't really, but I was very honored by this book review.
Well, it's a marvelous book, and you've done a marvelous job of reframing this critical period of time in our history. Thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thanks so much.
The book is Unreasonable Men.